So I can be seen as a person that is not impacted directly by racism and other forms of oppression. Why should those who are not affected by racism get involved in anti-racism movements?
Well, whether you believe it or not, we're all affected by racism. I think back to this morning, I was watching the news, and there was this family that they were doing a story on. The family was a Caucasian family who lived in suburbia, perfect family, you know, well-to-do, middle class, all that good stuff. They decided to adopt. They adopted 3 African-American kids. By them adopting those kids, their entire life has now changed. They did not realize until they adopted those kids that black lives truly did matter. Their kids brought that issue to the forefront for them. What got me the most about that story this morning was the kids decided to do a parade, a Black Lives Matter parade. So here you have these little 2 and 3-year-old kids marching down the street with their friends of all colors, with their signs on their backs saying Black Lives Matter. They did the parade as a fundraiser in support of Black Lives Matter. It's up to those of us, and those like you, who don't necessarily think it affects them, to realize that it does. Not only, it may not affect you directly, but by you not saying anything, you have an effect on the next generation that's coming up. It's up to our generation to be examples for those other kids as they're coming up to realize that their lives do matter. Otherwise, there will be no generation after them because they will be extinct. I think back to a walk I did downtown last Saturday, and I watched this group of older African American men and women stand on the grounds of the state capitol, surrounded by Confederate flags, Confederate monuments, grounds that at some point they would have been lynched if they stood there. But now they can stand there and hold a peaceful protest. They were surrounded by those of Caucasian descent, Indian descent. We have all of these groups coming together now who can stand there together. That is the example that I have in my life now. It's important that we all realize that racism does impact us, whether we realize it or not.
So what message would you have for people who think that the Black Lives Matter movement is inappropriate and it should be All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter?
So there's been several posts on Facebook around that topic. Until we realize that, yes, all lives are important. That is a fact. Everyone's life matters. Lost my train of thought. Because I'm trying to remember that post. Okay, I gotta think about that one.
Okay. For me, I think that given the current social climate, that the lives that are affected are African Americans, Black people. So, as you said, all lives do matter. Blue lives matter. The the topic, the social issue right now only affects African American people, which is why I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is the most important. And it's important to say and to know that Black Lives Matter, despite the fact that all lives matter, because what's happening in society today isn't affecting me the same way that it is affecting you.
Oh, absolutely. If you think back to Stonewall and the events that led to the gay movement, at that time, gay lives were being threatened. Gay lives mattered. It's not that all lives didn't matter, but at that particular time, it was the gay community that was being targeted with so many things. I think that holds true today, that it's African Americans, black men in particular, who are the targets of not only police brutality, but other issues as well, socioeconomic issues as well. And so until we can realize that this group is impacted, these lives do matter, that's how we are going to make change happen in this country.
I kind of see social issues as a pendulum. It will swing one way to the left and then swing completely to the right. Do you think that with the Black Lives Matter movement, that it'll cause issues between racial groups that will continue to kind of go back and forth? And how would you say we can act in a way to where it neutralizes it rather than a continuation?
I think we have to get to the root of the problems. Figure out what those problems are. Bring all people to the table to work on those issues. There is no reason why for example, our jail system should be in the shape that it is. There's no reason why a majority of the inmates in our prison systems are people of color. You just take a look at that and see, okay, what is going on? Why is that the case? When it comes to financial, economic issues, why is it that this one particular group is impacted the most? Even with COVID-19 and healthcare, why is it that this one group is impacted the most? What can we do to make these issues better? If we can work on that, I think we can make this country better.
What do you think the church's most important role right now is in the fight against racism?
I think the church's most critical role right now in the fight against racism and fight for justice is multiple layers. I mean, we've got to meet people where they are. And for some of us, particularly white people, depending on where we're at in this and our understanding, we have to pause and ask questions. If we don't understand, if there's something that just seems to be a bit uncomfortable, that's a good thing. We need to be uncomfortable. And we have to stop and ask questions about it. And what does that mean? We specifically need to be reaching out to our friends who are black and brown, people of color, and asking them, what can I do right now? What should I do? What should I know? How are you doing? How can I be there for you right now? And truly mean that, truly want to know what to do to help folks. And not coming into it with a white savior complex saying that I'm getting ready to step in and fix all of this, but finding out truly what I can do. So I think for some of us, that's where we need to be. We need to be asking questions and learning. There's a multitude of resources out there. If you don't understand racism, or you want to dig deeper and you feel like there's more that you just aren't grasping, then look for those resources. We have them on our website. Several other places have them, and there's several discussion groups that we're engaging with, just to have a place for people to have that conversation, to have that raw emotion. And a good place to start, if you don't know whether or not that you're supposed to look for resources like that, if you find yourself in a place where you're uncomfortable about something's going on, then ask. If you find yourself angry about things that are going on, ask. Do the research. Figure out what we need to do and what you can do. So look for the resources. Join some of those discussion groups, and allow yourself to be vulnerable. Where the church plays a huge role in that is we have to talk about it. For too long, the church has decided to sweep issues under the rug and to not talk about them. We don't want to talk about sex. We don't want to talk about money. We don't want to talk about all these other things that are taboo or that are unpopular topics to talk about. And so we ultimately create space where people don't grow, people don't learn, people aren't given the tools and resources they need. So when we do the same thing, we don't talk about racism, we enable people to ignore it and act like it doesn't exist. And the reality is, for black and brown people, they don't get the choice to pretend that racism doesn't exist. They don't get that opportunity. When a policeman is pulling them over, a police person is pulling them over, they don't get the choice to say, well, I can pretend this isn't going to be dangerous for me. And or in many other situations, they walk into a bank, when they walk through a parking lot and people are locking their doors when they're walking through the parking lot near their cars. So we have to be able to talk about it. Preachers need to preach about it. We need to talk about it from the pulpit. We need to have conversations with our congregations and talk about this so that we can truly open it up and learn and grow. And the church, I think, has a responsibility, has a calling to do that. If we look to what Jesus did, Jesus came to stand for justice for people, to be radical about loving people, and to show folks that we don't have to live under this systemic oppression and judgment and hatred and racism. Let's turn all that over and realize that this is about loving people. And so the church, when we allow stuff like that to happen, we're not living up to what our calling, particularly Christian church, we're not living up to what God has called us and put us here for. And so when we see that, we sometimes can look and see a lot of Christians, but we have to ask ourselves, where is Christ in that? And so we have an obligation, we have a calling, we have a responsibility to talk about it and to find ways to act. We oftentimes, in times of great distress and peril, we want to go to our default and say, we're going to think about you and pray for you. You're in our thoughts and prayers. That's the cliche thing. Absolutely, prayer is wonderful. Prayer is powerful. Prayer changes things. But when we pray, the part that I feel like we oftentimes forget is the action that comes after the prayer. When Jesus healed folks, yes, prayer was a component of it, but there was an action that followed, and you had to do something. And so we need to do that something. We need to ask what that something is, and we have to get up off of our behinds and get up and be the church. Yes, pray. And ask God what it is you're supposed to do, and pray for a miraculous healing, but then get up and be about that work.
Absolutely. Why do you think that it's important that people who are not affected by racism get involved and speak up?
Folks who aren't directly affected by racism have to get involved because it is all of us that are going to change this. First, I think Pastor Fred said the same thing, that there is not any one of us that isn't affected by racism. All of us are impacted by it, whether we admit it or not. We have to realize that, we have to acknowledge that, and we have to realize that we own a part of the responsibility for standing against it and correcting it. As long as we bury our heads in the sands or we refuse to get involved, we're enabling it to happen. We want to point fingers at other groups of people. It's easy to say, well, this was a white supremacist group that came in and did this. This was the KKK. This is these extremist organizations that are causing this. It's certainly not me. We have to realize that when we sit silent, that our silence is just as loud as the officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck. My silence, if I sit still and don't act and don't say that this is wrong and don't say that we have to do something, I may as well put a noose around George Floyd's neck and hung him up from a tree. It's not popular to say that, and it's not comfortable to say that. But that's where we're at. We're seeing people lynched in the streets every single day. We're seeing people gunned down at the hands of police, at the hands of other folks. We're seeing people murdered simply because of the color of their skin. Black men that are being murdered every single day. Even in the midst of everything going on, we've seen murders happening, including more police overreaching, police overstepping, and again, publicly lynching people on video camera. We see trans people of color, trans women of color specifically, that are murdered every single day simply for being who they are. And we have to say enough is enough somewhere. If we're going to love people, if we're going to say that we love people, particularly for those of us who identify as Christian, if I'm going to say that I'm a Christian and that I am trying to follow the Christ way of life, that includes me loving you. And I can't say that I love you if I can sit idly by and watch you being mistreated, if I can sit idly by and watch you and other people who look like you being murdered and do nothing about it. That's not love. That's not unconditional love. And so we have to understand that we have an obligation to act. We have a duty. And just as human, if we truly look to the humanity of it, we have an obligation to our fellow humans, fellow people, to say that that's not right. We had, this week, the highest court in the land passed and said that LGBTQ discrimination in the workforce was not okay. And that's a celebration. That's reason and cause for us to celebrate, because we had this great, monumental, groundbreaking decision sent out from the highest court in the land. But we had 3 justices on that court that said that it was okay to discriminate against somebody. 3 people on the highest court in the land that still said that it's okay for us to discriminate against these people. They don't deserve the same rights as everybody else. We can't sit by and watch that happen. Yes, we celebrate the victory. Yes, it was a victory. We celebrate that. But we have to find a way. This wasn't some major debating thing to determine the law. This was people's lives. What makes you human? And when we have 3 of those justices that can say that your life is worth less than somebody else's life, there's a problem. And it's rooted in systemic racism and systemic oppression that has been delivered over and over and over for hundreds of years in what we have claimed is the greatest nation on earth. That doesn't make me un-American to say that. But we have to own that we can't claim to be great, because we're not great for everybody. We have never been great for all people. And until we can say that we're great for everybody, we're not a truly great nation yet. We're striving to be, and we can be. We will be. But it's going to take all of us, those who are impacted directly by issues and those who are indirectly impacted by issues, to stand up and say enough is enough. And we want to leave this place better than we found it. We want to learn from our mistakes. This isn't about going back and bashing people. This is about saying, we got it wrong. We didn't do it the right way. But we've got an opportunity now to correct it going forward. We have an opportunity, I have an opportunity as a cisgendered white man to say, I've got some things wrong in my life. I've got some things that I'm still trying to flush out in my life. But I have an opportunity to learn. I can learn right now from what I did yesterday. I can learn right now through my lived experiences and through everybody else's lived experiences by being able to connect with one another and to ask those questions. How can I better serve? How can I better be there for you? And until we all feel that conviction, we can't see the change. We can't see this greatness that we see in America. We can't really, truly reveal it until we all feel that conviction to say, everybody has to have this opportunity. Everybody has to have the justice that we're seeking. Everybody needs to be able to say, this is the greatest country in the world. this is the best place in the world because everybody is loved, everybody is treated equally, everybody is created justly. So, hope that answered your question.
That and then some. You talk about standing up against racism by having conversations that make you feel uncomfortable. So what ways would you say that a person can become involved slowly by leaving their comfort zone to stand up against racism?
That's a really good question because a lot of folks, and we've been involved in activism for some time now, a lot of folks get scared when we talk about activism because they're scared that they're going to have to stand behind a bullhorn or do things that or go downtown and get arrested for civil disobedience and things like that. There are so many ways that we're all able to get involved. One of the things that struck me as so powerful when we were going down to the Poor People's Campaign a few years ago, and it was so hot out there in the middle of the summer months, and we were all sweating, and there was this group of people that simply were walking around handing out water. They weren't yelling, they weren't holding up signs, they simply were handing out water to all the folks that were there, making sure they stayed hydrated and made sure they were still okay. So there's ways that you can get involved that don't include, or don't require you to do other things. The road, there was something that went around about this recently, but the road of advocacy, the road of being an activist, has got many lanes, and you just need to pick the lane that is yours and get in that lane and go, as long as we're all moving forward. And so we need folks who are willing to phone bank. We need folks who are willing to write letters, to text folks. We need folks who are willing to drive folks to the polls, to educate people about elections. We need folks that are out there to educate people in general about the issues. And again, back to where we can start. If you don't know where else to start by learning what the issues are. Start by digging deeper into the issues. If racism is something that you just don't know enough about, or you feel like there's something you're missing, go learn. There's tons of resources. If you don't know where to start, call us. Look to our website. I mean, we'll help you find where your place is and a good place to start. So there's many ways that you can do that. We do need people that will go downtown and march. We need folks that will show up to rallies, folks that will speak, and all of those things. We need those folks that will go and risk arrest to say that enough is enough. But we do that within what we're called to do. It does take us getting out of our comfort zones. It does take us getting uncomfortable. But it doesn't mean you have to go and do something that you don't feel safe doing. It doesn't mean that you go out there and do things that you just really, truly don't want to do. Start simply by asking the question, what can I do? How can I get involved? And I think having those conversations, yes, the rallies are important. Yes, the protests, talking to our Congress folks are important, but we need folks that are willing to write letters to the Congress folk, to lawmakers, to the city leaders. And we also need folks that will simply do what we're doing now and having conversation, saying, you know what, this term makes me uncomfortable, or this word makes me, this whole situation, just, I don't understand it. Can you tell me a little more about that? And being able to have that conversation with folks, because that's where we grow. That's where we learn, and that's how we truly change the world, is by starting with a conversation like this, and then that conversation leading into action and to growing and going out and educating other people. When we start looking at what racism is, we all can stand by and say what we know, that when somebody calls somebody an ugly name, a derogatory name, that can be racism, and we can see those aggressions and police brutality and other things that are racism. But what we have to really understand is it goes much deeper than that. Those are some of the symptoms and signs of racism. But what we see is this systemic oppression and systemic racism that has been boiling for hundreds of years, that is made evident through extreme poverty, disproportionate poverty amongst black and brown communities, health care that's not made available to all people equally, We've seen that this year alone with coronavirus and how it has disproportionately impacted black and brown people. And it's not because the virus was racist. It's because a racist society has created a disproportionate healthcare system so that black and brown people aren't afforded the same rights in healthcare as other folks. And so you've created this disparity. And so we've seen that with economic injustice, all going back to this system of oppression and system of racism that really has to be changed. So yes, there are people dying every day at the hands of violence, but there are more people dying every day at the hands of violence that we're not detecting because they didn't have proper health care, because they didn't have proper funding and they didn't have equal wages, living, not even equal wages, they didn't have living wages. And so you've got folks that are dying every single day because they were born black, or they were born brown, or they were born poor white, and they don't have the same opportunities. We have folks that are, mass incarcerations that are happening against black and brown communities, modern day slavery. We don't see that. All of this is rooted in the same evil, in the same disparities that created the system. And so we have to go back and change. We have to have a systemic change. It isn't just about getting people to stop using the N-word or all these other things that we think about when we think about racism. This is about going much, much deeper than that and changing a system that was built and designed to oppress black people and poor people, and now it's being applied to immigrants and migrants. We still have, the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter movement have emerged much louder, but we still have folks in detention camps, essentially modern-day concentration camps that we have folks living in along the border. We still have this notion of the wall that was being built, or is being built, and whatever is happening with that. I would say that, and this may not be a popular opinion, we got very critical over Donald Trump's wall. Many of the folks that were more progressive didn't care for that. Where were those voices when the walls of America had been built over centuries that oppressed people? We had walls built long before Donald Trump even mentioned his wall. We had walls built up around our hearts. We had walls that go up when we start talking about different issues that are hot button issues. We have walls that were built up when we wanted to ignore the violence that was happening to black and brown communities and the racism that was so evident, but we wanted to turn a blind eye to it. So I would say that a lot of our anger and frustration that came out during the Donald Trump wall might have been more of a self-reflective anger on the walls that we had built up ourselves. And so as we think about stopping the wall that Trump tries to build or tearing the wall down, maybe we ought to hear the voice of Ronald Reagan and saying, tear down that wall, to our own selves saying it. Tear down that wall. Maybe that needs to be in our prayers. God, tear down the walls that are blocking me from being able to see your justice and see your love and to see other people as who you called and created me. Tear down the walls that are stopping me from being able to see the evident racism and poverty and inequality that's happening right before my very eyes. I was raised in the notion that you make your way in this world. I was born into a poor family, and I was taught from a very early age, you decide your own success. You have to, you're responsible for that. You have to be able to go out and to do well for yourself. And so by default, when you hear that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, to just teach you to strive for what's good and to strive to do more for yourself. And my parents' notions were that we want you to have better than what we have. We want you to be more educated and have these opportunities that we didn't have. That's not bad. That's good to want that for your children. The danger we come into is we get this notion, and I had this notion, that everybody had to work hard for what they got. But the flip side of that was I also equated to people who didn't do well, they must not have been working hard enough. And it goes back to this notion that I can't remember who said it, but when we tell folks to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, we have to make sure they got a pair of boots first. We tell folks to do that. We tell you to go out and work and to do. But if we don't give you the basic tools, or you didn't have the basic tools to start with, how do we expect you to be able to do that? And so we are starting out in an unequal footing. We're starting out without the tools, the basic tools that we need to live, the basic things, equal wages or fair wages, living wages. Our minimum wage right now is what, $7.25. To live in Wake County, I believe we did a study, and you had to have about $18 an hour to live.
Wow.
You're making less, if you're on minimum wage, you're making less than half what you need to be able to survive in Wake County. And I think another study that was done more recently, looking at Wake downtown or generally the city of Raleigh, that you needed to make over $20 an hour. So how do we expect people to be able to live? How do we expect folks to be able to grow from that? I was talking to someone this week. They need to go to a dentist. They don't have health insurance. They have another issue that they need to go and get treated, that they can't go and get treated because they don't have the money to do that. And then they have other bills and other things that are necessities for life that they have to worry with. And so they're truly faced with, do I buy groceries this week? And which one of, if I have a little bit of money left over, which one of my medical issues can I treat? And this is basic care in America. I can't go get a physical. I can't go get my tooth fixed. I can't go and have my foot looked at after I've stepped on a nail and get a tetanus shot to ensure that I don't have to go into the hospital later because I've contracted tetanus or had to. We're having to make decisions about how we can best survive in America because we don't have health care for people. We don't have an opportunity for folks to live. And the likelihood is that person will die an early death because they were poor. They'll die because they were poor. Not because they had bad health, but because they could not get the same health care that other folks have the right to have. And how is that fair? How can anybody argue that that's fair? You talk about nutrition and you talk about food deserts. You talk about people eating healthy. It's easy to say, well, you need to eat healthy. But I can tell you from somebody who is living in some degree of poverty, when I go to the grocery store, and especially with meat prices going up right now, the cheap chicken and the pork is what I can afford. Pork is really what I can afford. Pork's the one thing I don't need to be eating. But I can afford to eat that. And that's from somebody who does have a job and has an income coming in. Think about folks who have much less than that, and folks who do live in these food deserts. And we're not even talking about eating healthy in the way of organic foods and looking at that. I mean, yes, it's a great idea to want to eat organic and to eat healthy food that's pesticide-free, but that costs. And it's not available everywhere. We don't all have we've got a farmer's market sitting right down the street from us where we're recording this tonight. I can walk down to the farmer's market. Not everybody has a farmer's market within walking distance, and they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and those healthy foods. So you have people living in food deserts that don't even have access. Even if they had the money, they don't have the access to the food. So how do we expect people? Again, we're expecting you to pull yourself up by your bootstrap, but you don't even have a pair of boots yet. And so how do we create an atmosphere where we're able to care for one another and to make sure that we all have enough? The disparity in what we see in America is what is so sickening. And that's just the plain truth of it. It's sickening when we can see the CEOs of these healthcare organizations flying around in private jets and we have somebody who's literally going to die, that's dying this moment because they couldn't afford health care. That somebody that's dying because they couldn't afford good food to eat. Children that are malnourished because the schools are closed right now and they don't have food to eat. Children that are living in homelessness. I think one of the last studies I looked at, the Wake County system had about 4,000 youth that were identified as living in or experiencing homelessness. 4,000. But we've got corporate greed. Millions and millions and millions of dollars. There's a problem. There's a real problem with that. And not to make it about politics, but we have a president who has said that we're giving our $400,000 a year, our salary, back to charitable organizations. We're not even taking this salary. But one trip to the golf course, and not saying the president shouldn't be protected, one trip to the golf course cost more than what your annual salary was. So tell me how that's fair. How do we have an atmosphere where we can play the smoke screen? It's because we've allowed it. We were pitted against one another back after the Reconstruction. We were pitted against one another. We had this concerted effort to conquer and divide, or divide and conquer. We wanted to tell poor white folks that it was poor black folks that they were poor, and tell poor black folks that it was white folks' problem, reasons that they're poor. We pitted each other against one another, all while this systemic oppression continued to happen, and we were too busy looking at the smokescreen that had been created. And it still happens today. We still are blinded by the same things today. We see, it drove me mad watching television here recently in Raleigh. We were talking about the protests that were happening downtown, and they showed video. The first couple of nights we had some rioting that happened, but that stopped after the first couple of nights, and it was peaceful protest. And even those first 2 days were largely peaceful protest. We had a faction of things that happened in that later evening, but it was all peaceful protest with clear demands, organized groups that were coming together saying this has got to stop. The news media was covering this several days after the fact, and they were talking about, we heard them saying peaceful protest, but the images they were showing on the screen was the rioting. So we're painting the picture of this bad, horrible thing, and we're distracting from the movement itself. And we're automatically pitting folks against one another because we now judged all protest based off of what a few folks did. Based all protest off of what the rioting was doing. And so when we did that, we took the attention off of the real issues to say we've got to stand for justice. And I don't condone the rioting. I absolutely don't condone the rioting, but at some point in time we have to say, you know what, it made me uncomfortable to see this rioting happening. It made me uncomfortable to see the CVS burning in downtown Raleigh and to see folks walking out with stuff. But that was something that I got to sit and watch on television and experience for an evening. Maybe 2 evenings if you watched it for 2 evenings in a row. Fred's experienced it for 40 years. Having to worry when he's pulled over by the police whether or not this is the stop that's going to end his life. Having to walk into the bank or walk by cars and have people locking the doors on them. For black and brown people, this has happened their entire lives. It's happened for 400 years. So if one evening of protest and riots made me upset and angry, it damn well ought to have. It should have, but it should also make me beg the question, what is this like to have experienced this for 40 years? What is it like to have experienced this for 80 years? What is it like to have to know that this is generational and that my mama and daddy had to live with this and that my grandma and grandpa had to live with this and their parents and their grandparents? What is it like to have to know that that is the way of life every single day? That's what ought to drive us to action and drive us to say that this can't keep going on. Because that made me uncomfortable, and it was only for 12 hours. Made me mad, and it was only for 12 hours. And I got to go get in my comfortable bed and sleep after it. I didn't have to wake up the next morning and worry whether or not my life would be ended today because of the color of my skin.
So you touch on the topic of poverty and need. What would you say to the person or family watching that might have too much pride to step up for assistance from the different programs that St. John's is involved in that does need assistance?
First, I'd say I know where you're at. If part of it is pride and you don't want to ask for help, and you've been taught that asking for help was a sign of weakness, I know where you're at with that to some degree, and we're here for anybody. One of the things that I found beautiful about what we do with the food program and with the meal program and with the food pantry is when you come up to eat, when you come up to have dinner with us, this is not a dinner that is served to the homeless community. This is a dinner that is served at a community center for anybody who walks through that door. When you come through that door, I don't know if you slept in a tent last night, if you slept under a bridge overpass, or if you slept in one of the $500,000 houses sitting across the street from us. I don't know where you slept. I'm not going to know where you slept unless you open up and talk to me about it. And that's the beauty of it, is we don't make any prejudgment about who you are, where you came from, or what your level of need or level of success in life, or what your socioeconomic status is. It's a place for anybody to come and eat. And the other beautiful part about that is it brings people together across all backgrounds and all walks of life that might have never otherwise become connected. It gives us the opportunity to sit down beside of folks that we would have never sat down with before, and to eat, and to share and break bread and share that meal, to have communion. That communion to me is as powerful as any communion that we've ever served from the altar here, because that is exactly what Jesus was teaching us when we talk about the story of the Last Supper. It was breaking bread together, finding that love and that connectedness and that relationship that we have to one another. And so if you're worried about being judged, if you're worried about the need, come. That's what it's here for. There's no judgment. There's no questions. There's no forms to fill out to tell us who you are, or what you make, or where you came from. It's simply a place for you to stop in and eat. Simply a place for you to come in and find some rest. Simply a place for you to come in and find family, to come in and just sit and be with one another. We have folks that come out here and just sit under the trees and talk with folks. They're not living in an impoverished situation in some cases. They just simply want to be around people. They simply want to be with people and share stories. So know that it's okay. Know that one, you're not going to be judged. And then two, know that sometimes it takes a lot to ask for help. And it can't, but it is so empowering when we do. Because we're all here to help one another. It's not that I'm going to come in and save you, or I'm not going to come in and fix your problems. But I can talk to you about it, and I can work with you, and we can share resources. It may be that you have something that I need. I sat in my office this past week, and a gentleman came in and wanted me to pray with him and talk to him about some things that were going on in his life. And by the end of that conversation, he was thanking me for doing that, and I was thanking him for doing it, because in and through that moment, that prayer, and that time that we got to spend together, I realized I needed him to do that, because I needed to be reminded and rooted into to who I was and just where I was. It wasn't that I needed to be able to pray for him. I needed him to pray for me. I needed him to hold my hand and to say that it was going to be okay. And so when we come together, we find that if we can get rid of this notion that we can't ask for help, we can't ask each other, that's what we are called into community for, is to be able to share and make sure that we all have enough. There's no reason for me to have a Thanksgiving feast on my table and you to go hungry. There's no, you have things that I may need. You have knowledge. You have life experience that I may need. You may have food that but when we come together and we make those needs known, we're able to fulfill each other's needs. And lastly, I would say this is the hard part for us to be able to transition. But when I don't let my needs be known, I inadvertently am robbing somebody else of their blessing and of their ability to do and live out the gifts that God has placed in their lives. If God has called you to be able to come up to this center and provide food or provide meals or to provide counsel to folks, whatever it is you're doing, or at home, but if I don't ask you for that, if that gentleman hadn't came and asked me for prayer that day, I wouldn't have gotten the blessing that I needed. I wouldn't have gotten the blessing I needed had he not done that. It started out with him saying he needed something, but it ended up with me being realizing that I was the one with the need. And so we can ultimately rob somebody else of their blessing and their ability to use the gifts God's blessed them with if we don't enter into that relationship with one another and let folks know where we're at. Okay.
Who's got to edit this?
Jim?
Poor Jim.
Jim, we love you.
Thank you.